You let me call you a janitor for 11 years, and you own this entire building?
You own this building? Where Corey's office is?
I have. Longer than we've been married.
Why won't you tell me? 11 years, Derek. 11 years you let me think you were just...
I figured the woman sharing my bed would be different.
I'm sorry. Derek, I am so sorry. Please, give me a chance to fix this.
You already made your choice.
But Derek wasn't finished. Because the man she called an upgrade, sitting right now in a corner office inside this very building, was about to hear his own contempt played back to him, in a room he thought he controlled. Derek Coleman was 46 years old, and he believed something most folks in Chicago had stopped believing a long time ago, that a quiet life, built one honest day at a time, was worth more than any title a man could print on a business card. That belief was about to be tested in a kitchen in Hyde Park on a Tuesday night in October by the woman who had shared his bed for 11 years. "I want a divorce, Derek," Anaya said, not looking up from her phone. "I've met someone, an upgrade." 4 sentences, that's all it took to end 11 years. But here's what Anaya didn't know. The man across the table from her, the one she'd just called replaceable, owned the building where her upgrade kept his office. All 40 floors of it. He'd suspected the affair for 5 months and had proof for 4 before she ever opened her mouth. Before we get into the story, if you believe loyalty still means something in this world and that truth always finds its way to light, hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Now let's go back to where this all started. Derek had grown up in this city, in a 2-flat on the south side his grandfather bought back in 1961, long before the neighborhood was worth what it's worth today. He still remembered his grandfather's hands, thick and scarred, and the way the old man used to say, "Own something quiet, son. Let the world make noise about somebody else." Every morning at 5:40, Derek backed his Ford pickup, 12 years old now with 140,000 miles on it, out of the garage of a Hyde Park brownstone most neighbors assumed he rented. He drove 18 minutes north into the Loop, parked in the same employee spot he'd used for the better part of 2 decades, and walked through the loading dock of 200 South Wacker Drive before the sun had fully cleared Lake Michigan. He liked the building at that hour. Quiet. Just the hum of the ventilation system and the soft slap of his own work boots against polished marble. People who passed through that lobby knew Derek Coleman as the head of maintenance. A tall man, solid through the shoulders, a few threads of gray at his temples, and a small scar along his jawline. He wore navy coveralls most days, kept his tools organized like a surgeon kept instruments, and greeted every tenant by name, whether they greeted him back or not. They called him the good one, the janitor everybody liked. Steady, reliable, invisible, in the way people who do necessary work often become invisible to the ones who benefit from it. Derek never bothered to correct anybody. He simply did his rounds. He checked the boiler room on the 3rd sublevel. He walked the 12th floor, running his cough along the same brass railings every day. He glanced up at the security monitors near the loading dock out of old habit, the way another man might check his watch. That particular Tuesday had been unremarkable, cool for October, with a low fog rolling off the river. Derek fixed a sticking door on the 9th floor, replaced a flickering fluorescent tube in a stairwell, and ate his lunch, a thermos of coffee and a turkey sandwich his mother had taught him to make 30 years back, alone on a bench outside, watching the trains cross the river. He had no idea that by dinner time, his marriage would be over. That night, Anaya came home late from what she called a client dinner, her heels clicking against the hardwood in a rhythm Derek had learned to read over the years. Quick and certain when she felt powerful. hesitant when she felt guilty. Tonight, they were quick. She set her purse on the counter, poured herself a glass of wine she didn't offer to share, and said it plainly, the way a person reads off a grocery list. "I want a divorce, Derek. I've met someone. An upgrade." Derek didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask her to repeat herself. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands still faintly smelling of floor wax and the citrus soap from the building supply closet. And he simply looked at her. My wife, he thought, watching her deliver the line like something she'd rehearsed in the car. 11 years, and she still didn't know him well enough to guess what was coming. "His name is Corey," Anaya went on, emboldened by his silence, mistaking it for defeat. "He's a broker. Keeps an office right in the Loop, actually. 200 South Wacker. You'd probably like the lobby. It's beautiful." Derek's expression didn't change. Not a flicker. Somewhere behind his calm brown eyes, a memory surfaced, unbidden. 8 months of double shifts 6 years back so Anaya could afford that public relations certificate downtown. A promotion to supervisor at a sister property out in Schaumburg that he'd turned down without ever telling her, because it would have meant an hour-and-a-half commute away from her every night. He said none of it out loud. He only gave a small, even nod. "Okay," he said quietly, "if that's what you want." Anaya blinked, thrown for just a second by how easy it was. She'd expected tears, maybe some pleading. She got neither. She had no idea what she'd just handed him, telling him exactly where Corey kept his office, or what that little detail was about to cost her before this was over. Because somewhere in a locked drawer in Derek's study, there was a folder with Corey's name already in it. And nobody in that kitchen but Derek knew it existed yet. Stay with me, because what Derek already knew was about to change everything. The next morning, Derek showed up at 200 South Wacker Drive at his usual time, like nothing in his life had changed at all. He rode the service elevator to the 12th floor, the floor where Anaya's public relations firm leased 3 corner offices, and began his rounds the way he always did. Vacuum the carpet runners, wipe down the glass partitions, check the thermostat in the main conference room, which had been running warm all week. He heard Anaya before he saw her. She was standing near the window with her phone pressed to her ear, laughing in that bright, performative way she used when she wanted to sound carefree. "Stop it," she said, low and pleased. "You're terrible. I'll see you tonight." She hung up, turned, and spotted Derek kneeling by the supply closet with his toolbox open. "Oh, good, you're here," she said, as if nothing had happened between them the night before. "The AC in the East Conference Room is running warm again. Can you have somebody look at it? Mr. Reed's got investors coming through this afternoon, and I don't want him sweating through his presentation." Mr. Reed. Corey's last name, spoken so casually, like it belonged to her already. She's still my wife, for a few more weeks at least, Derek thought, watching her turn back toward the window without a second glance his way. And she's already saying his name like a title she's practicing. Derek simply nodded. "I'll take care of it," he said, and he meant it. The thermostat really was faulty, and he was, above all, a man who did his job well no matter what. That was simply how small his marriage had become to her. An afterthought, filed somewhere below office comfort. He fixed the thermostat. He finished his shift. He clocked out at 4:30 and drove south. Derek's mother, Bianca, still lived in the same Hyde Park house where she'd raised him, a 2-story with a wraparound porch and a swing that had been creaking since before Derek was born. Bianca was 71 now, silver hair pinned neat at the back of her neck, and she'd learned long ago not to waste tears before hearing the whole story. She was on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl in her lap, when Derek's truck pulled up. "You're early," she said, not looking up. "Something's wrong." "Anaya wants a divorce," Derek said, sitting down beside her on the top step. "She's seeing somebody, says he's an upgrade." Bianca's hands stilled over the bowl for just a moment. Then she set it aside, stood, and walked into the house without a word. Derek followed her into the small back room she still called the office, though it hadn't been an office in 40 years. Just a filing cabinet and an old iron safe that had belonged to Derek's grandfather. She knelt in front of the safe, turned the dial with the same steady hands she'd used to teach Derek to tie his shoes, and pulled out a thick folder tied with ribbon. "Your grandfather bought that building in 1985, Bianca said, laying the folder on the desk. It had just gone up a few years before, and most people thought he'd overpaid. But he had a feeling about that stretch of the loop, and he was right. Over the years, the family trust picked up 2 more properties downtown. You've been the trustee since your father passed, Derek. You know all this." "I know," Derek said quietly. "I've just never needed to say it out loud to anybody who didn't already know." Bianca looked at her son for a long moment, the porch swing outside still creaking faintly in the evening wind. "There's something else you should know," she said. "I've suspected about that man for 3 months now." Derek looked up sharply. 3 months? "Anaya called me back in July, asking to borrow money. Said it was for a personal matter. I didn't press her on it, but she let it slip she needed it before Corey found out how tight things were. I didn't say a word to you because I didn't have proof, and I wasn't about to break my son's heart over a feeling. I just watched." Bianca's jaw tightened. "I raised you to gather the truth before you swing at anything." "I was doing the same." Derek nodded slowly, something steady settling in his chest. The calm of a man realizing he wasn't standing alone in this after all. That evening, Derek called Ariana Bell, the attorney who had handled the family trust's paperwork for the better part of a decade. She picked up on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," Ariana said. "You knew this was coming?" "Derek, you reached out to me 5 months ago asking me to quietly pull the security footage retention logs from the 12th and 15th floors of your own building. You asked me to start drafting divorce paperwork you told me not to file yet. I've had a folder with your name on it sitting in my office since May. I didn't know exactly what you suspected, but I knew you suspected something." Derek let out a slow breath. It was true. Back in May, a small detail had snagged in his mind. The way Anaya had started coming home smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his. The way her phone had started facing screen down on every surface. He hadn't known who or when it would come to a head, but he'd learned long ago that a man who waits until he's certain before he prepares usually ends up unprepared. "There's more," Ariana said. "I did some digging on Corey Reed once you gave me the name last week. He's carrying significant debt, Derek. 2 failed ventures in the last 3 years, a lawsuit from a former investment partner in Naperville that got quietly settled, and right now, he's actively courting new investors using the reputation of a building he doesn't own, implying connections he doesn't have." "My building," Derek said. "Your building," Ariana confirmed. "He's been telling people he has an inside track with ownership. I think he believes Anaya can get him closer to whoever actually holds the deed." "There's one more thing," Ariana said, "and it's going to surprise you. The trust's investment arm has held a small, passive limited partner stake in Corey's fund for the last 2 years, through the outside portfolio managers who handle our diversified holdings. It's the kind of position you'd never notice on a quarterly statement, but it means we're legally entitled to the same investor materials every other backer receives, including recordings of his quarterly update calls." "Pull them." "Already requested," Ariana said. "Compliance archives everything. I'll have the full set by Friday." Derek was quiet for a long moment, standing alone in the maintenance office deep in the sublevels of 200 South Wacker, surrounded by monitors feeding in from every hallway in the building. He pulled up an old archived clip, time-stamped from 4 months back. Silent footage from the 15th floor hallway camera. Anaya and Corey standing close together near the elevator bank, heads bent toward each other. No audio worth mentioning, just two people standing closer than colleagues should. It wasn't proof of anything on its own. It was simply a piece of a picture he'd been assembling for months. He'd watched this clip before. He watched it again now, not out of anger, but the way a man checks a foundation before he decides how much weight it can hold. "Send me everything you have on Corey by tomorrow morning," Derek said. "And Ariana, don't file anything yet, not until I say." "You've got a plan," Ariana said. It wasn't a question. "I've had one for a while," Derek answered. But there was still one more thing sitting in that locked drawer of his study. Something that would matter more to Anaya than any deed or folder ever could. Before this was over, it was going to cost her far more than she knew. Derek had proof his wife was cheating 5 months before she ever said the word divorce. And he chose to stay silent and build his case, instead of confronting her on day one. Team strategy. Comment strategy if staying quiet that long was the smartest move he ever made. Team honesty. Comment honesty if 5 months of silence makes him just as guilty of hiding the truth as she was. Pick one. No fence sitting. Derek asked Anaya to meet him at the house on Saturday morning before she moved the last of her things out. She arrived expecting an argument, or maybe a plea. She found neither. She found a manila folder waiting on the kitchen table, the same table where she'd ended their marriage 6 days earlier. It was a gray Saturday, the kind of Chicago morning where the sky over Lake Michigan sits low and undecided, and a thin mist beaded on the windshield of the car parked in the driveway she no longer had any claim to. She'd dressed carefully anyway, a cream blazer and the small gold earrings Derek had given her on their 5th anniversary, as if the right outfit could still manage a room the way it always used to. "Sit down," Derek said. Not cold, just steady. Anaya sat, arranging her coat over the back of the chair with the same practiced composure she used in client meetings. She opened the folder. The deed was on top. 200 South Wacker Drive, Chicago, Illinois. Title held by the Coleman Family Trust. Trustee, Derek J. Coleman. Beneath it, records for 2 additional commercial properties in the Loop and a rent roll going back 11 years, showing every tenant and every dollar that had passed through that building, including the modest monthly fee her own firm paid to lease its 12th floor offices. Her hands started to shake. "You own this building," she said, barely above a whisper. "You own the building where my office is, where Corey's office is." "I have for a long time," Derek said. "Longer than we've been married." "Why wouldn't you tell me?" Her voice cracked, rising now, closer to panic than anger. 11 years, Derek! 11 years, and you let me think you were… She stopped herself before she said it. Just a janitor. Just a man in navy coveralls who fixed thermostats and mopped floors. But the word had already done its work in the silence, and something in Derek's chest went quiet and still. "My grandfather taught me that a man doesn't need the whole room to know what he's worth," Derek said. "I figured the woman sharing my bed would be different. I was wrong about that part." Anaya pressed her fingers to her mouth. The papers blurred in front of her, and it took her a moment to realize she was crying. She thought back, in a rush she couldn't stop, to 100 small moments she'd never once questioned. The way Derek always knew which contractor to call when something in the building broke. The way certain people in his crew addressed him with a respect that seemed too large for a man who supposedly emptied trash cans for a living. She had looked directly at the answer for 11 years, and never once bothered to ask the question. "The building inspector last spring," she said slowly, almost to herself. He called you Mr. Coleman, like you were somebody. I laughed about it in the car. I told Corey you probably just tipped him well. Derek said nothing. He didn't need to. Derek reached into the folder and pulled out a second, thinner stack. Bank statements, older, the ink slightly faded. He slid them across the table. 3 years ago, your mother's heart started giving out, he said quietly. You remember the bills, the specialist in Evanston, the 2 procedures at Rush. You told me the insurance covered most of it. It did, Anaya said, confused now. It covered about 60%, Derek said. I covered the rest. Quietly. Out of what you thought was a janitor's paycheck. $31,000 over 14 months, so your mother could keep seeing the doctor she trusted instead of getting shuffled into the county system. I never told you because I didn't do it to be thanked. I did it because she was your mother, and because that's what family does. Anaya made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something broken and small, and slid out of her chair onto her knees on the kitchen floor, her hands gripping the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing left in the room. I'm sorry, she said, over and over, the words tumbling out faster than she could control them. Derek, I'm so sorry. Please, please, just give me a chance to fix this. Derek didn't move to help her up. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, patient in the way a man is patient with weather, understanding that a storm has to finish what it started before the sky clears. For 11 years, she had been my wife in every sense that mattered to him. Coffee in the mornings, her hand in his at her father's funeral, her name the first one he thought of in trouble. Watching her now, on the floor of a kitchen she was about to lose, he realized that word had already quietly changed tense in his mind, from something he was living to something he had lived. There's one more thing, Anaya said, wiping her face with the back of her wrist, another confession spilling loose now that the first one had broken the dam. Your mother. She called me 2 months ago. She told me, Derek isn't the man you think he is. You need to be careful what you throw away. I thought she was just protecting her son. I thought she was trying to scare me off Corey out of spite. I didn't listen. I told her she didn't understand what Corey and I had. Anaya's shoulders shook. She knew. She tried to warn me, and I threw it back in her face. Anaya hadn't ignored Bianca's warning because she doubted it. She ignored it because believing it would have meant admitting she'd traded something real for a feeling. And her deepest fear was never poverty. It was invisibility. The terror of staying married to a man the world overlooked and being overlooked right along with him. Chasing an upgrade was never really about Corey. It was about outrunning a version of herself she was ashamed of. And now that version had caught up with her on a kitchen floor. Derek closed his eyes for just a moment, not in anger, in something closer to grief. The ache of learning the people who loved you had been standing guard the whole time, and it still hadn't been enough to stop the fall. My mother doesn't waste words, he said finally. If she told you to be careful, she wasn't protecting me. She was trying to protect you. Anaya looked up at him, mascara streaked, the polish she wore like armor stripped away now. Please, she whispered. I'll do anything. I'll end it with Corey today. I'll go to counseling. You already made your choice, Derek said. And for the first time, his voice carried something firmer underneath the calm. Not loud, never loud, but final. You looked at 11 years of a man showing up for you, and you called it small. You called it something you needed to upgrade from. Now you know exactly what you were standing next to the whole time. And it doesn't change a single thing about what you already decided. He stood, gathering the folder and the bank statements with unhurried hands, squaring the edges the way he squared everything in his life. With care, without drama. He didn't slam a door. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at her one more time, kneeling there on the floor, and felt something inside himself settle into place, quiet and complete. "I'll have Ariana send the paperwork," he said. "Take whatever's yours. Leave the rest." He walked out onto the back porch and stood there for a long moment in the cool morning air, listening to Anaya's ragged breathing through the screen door, the sound of a woman realizing, several years too late, exactly what she'd been careless with. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't needed to. Somewhere underneath the calm, Derek felt the old ache too. The one he'd carried quietly for months and never let anyone see, not even his mother. None of those 11 years had been a lie on his end, and that was what sat heaviest on him now, standing alone on a porch that still smelled of last night's rain. He hadn't done any of it expecting a reward. He just hadn't expected to be handed this particular kind of ending. He let himself feel it for exactly as long as it took to finish one slow breath. Then he straightened his shoulders the way he always did before a long shift and walked back toward his truck. But Derek Coleman had not yet made his final decision about what came next, and there was a second conversation still waiting to happen, one considerably less gentle than this one. Because the man she'd called an upgrade had made a serious mistake, out loud on a recorded line he thought had already gone dead, inside a building he understood far less than he thought. What was coming for Corey Reed was going to be a great deal worse than a folder of paperwork across a kitchen table. Don't go anywhere, because Corey is about to hear his own voice used against him. The invitation had gone out through Ariana's office, formal letterhead, a simple request for a meeting regarding building ownership matters. No hint of what waited on the other side of it. Derek had chosen the 15th floor on purpose. It was the same floor where Corey liked to meet Anaya after hours. The same hallway camera that had quietly caught them standing close together for months. There was a certain justice in bringing a man face to face with the exact spot where his carelessness had first been caught on tape. Corey Reed had never once been summoned to the 15th floor conference room by the building's own maintenance staff, and it seemed to amuse him more than concern him. He arrived Thursday afternoon in a charcoal suit that had cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, his watch catching the light as he checked it for effect rather than for the time. He smiled the way he always smiled, like a man who had already won whatever conversation was about to happen. "Derek, right?" he said, settling into the chair across the table without waiting to be asked. "Anaya's husband. Ex-husband, I should say. I've got 15 minutes before my next call, so let's make this quick, whatever this is." Derek was already seated at the head of the table, the chairman's seat, hands folded calmly in front of him, a slim folder resting beneath his palms. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows framed the gray sweep of the Chicago River 15 stories below. "You've got as long as I need you to have," Derek said. Corey's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, then rebuilt itself, wider. "Look, man, I get that this is uncomfortable for you. But there's really nothing to discuss here. Anaya's made her choice. You should focus on, moving forward. Maybe management's got a lower floor unit you could look at renting, if you're worried about running into us in the building." "I'm not renting anything in this building," Derek said. "I own it. All 40 floors, since before you and I ever crossed paths. My grandfather bought it in 1985. My family trust has held the title ever since. I'm the man you've been calling an idiot janitor to my wife, in this very building for the last several months." The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Corey's eyes moved from Derek's face to the skyline behind him, the one he'd spent months imagining himself owning a piece of, and back again, as if trying to reconcile the navy coveralls he'd pictured this man wearing with the calm figure now sitting in the chairman's seat. It didn't reconcile. Nothing about this moment matched the story he'd built for himself. "This is a joke," Corey said, his voice climbing half an octave. "This has to be some kind of setup. People like you don't own buildings like this." "People like me built this city's skyline while wearing coveralls," Derek said evenly. "You just never bothered to look twice at who was holding the ladder." Corey's laugh came out thin, unconvincing. That's quite a story." "It's not a story. It's a deed." Derek slid a single document across the table, the ownership record, with the trust's seal at the bottom. Corey stared at it without touching it, the color draining slowly from his face. He recovered fast, or tried to, straightening his jacket and leaning forward with the aggression men use to cover panic. "Okay, fine. So you own the building. That doesn't change anything about Anaya and me. And if you're trying to intimidate me, I should tell you I've got a lawyer, and I will absolutely pursue harassment claims if you try anything funny with my lease, my business, any of it." "I'm not going to touch your lease," Derek said. "I don't need to." He reached into the folder and pulled out a small playback device, setting it on the table between them. "You do quarterly update calls for your investors," Derek said. "Every one of them opens with a recorded disclosure, standard compliance practice. My family trust happens to hold a small, limited partner position in your fund, has for 2 years, which means we get the same call archive every other backer gets." He pressed play. Corey's own voice filled the room, pulled from a call 6 weeks earlier, the moment he'd assumed the line had already gone dead, before a private aside to a colleague. "Compliance systems don't stop recording the second someone thinks they've hung up." "That janitor Derek's an idiot," the recording said, Corey's laugh threading through the words. "He's never going to figure out what's happening right under his nose. Once my contact gets the ownership details sorted, we buy this building for a steal. Trust me, guys like that don't ask questions. They just mop floors and say thank you." The color left Corey's face entirely. A thin sheen of sweat broke across his forehead, and his hand, resting on the polished table, had begun to tremble in a way that his expensive watch couldn't hide. That's private," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "You can't use that. That's not even—" "It's a routine business call your own compliance department recorded, with a consent disclosure you agreed to at the start of every session," Derek said. "Every investor on that call heard the same thing I just played you. That's not my doing. That's yours." "You were serious enough to build an entire investment pitch around it," Derek said quietly. "You've been telling potential partners you have an inside track with ownership of this property, implying connections you don't have to people who deserve better than that." "You don't understand what's at stake for me right now," Corey said, and for the first time, the polish cracked entirely, revealing something desperate underneath. "I've got investors lined up. If word gets around that this deal is compromised, I lose everything. Please, Derek, we can figure something out. I'll leave Anaya alone. I'll never come near this building again. Just don't—" "There's one more thing you should know," Derek said, cutting through the pleading without raising his voice. "The largest investor backing your current fund just withdrew, effective this morning. That fund is connected to a holding entity managed by my family trust. You didn't lose one deal today, Corey. You lost access to the capital pipeline your entire business has been built around for 3 years." Corey's arrogance had never really been confidence. It was armor, built years ago after his first fund collapsed, a rehearsed defense against the fear that without the performance, there was nothing underneath worth investing in. He'd mocked Derek as just a janitor because some part of him recognized in that quiet, steady man everything he'd never managed to become. And now, hearing his own voice handed back to him in a room full of silence, there was no script left to perform. Corey's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Whatever he'd planned to say next simply evaporated, replaced by the blankness of a man watching his foundation give way in real time. "That's not possible," he finally managed. "That fund has no connection to—" "Check the paperwork," Derek said. "It's already been sent to your office." Corey looked down at his own hands, trembling now without any pretense of control. And something in his expensive suit seemed to hang differently on him, as if the confidence that had filled it out drained away. "Please," he said again, quieter now, all the swagger gone. "There has to be some kind of arrangement. I'll do anything. I'll sign an NDA. I'll pay whatever you—" Derek stood. He didn't answer the offer. He didn't need to. He gathered the folder, tucked the small playback device back into his coat pocket, and walked toward the door without another word, leaving Corey Reed alone at a conference table with a document he now understood far too late. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. Derek walked down the 15th floor hallway alone, his footsteps unhurried against the same carpet runners he'd vacuumed 1,000 times before. He didn't look back toward the conference room. He didn't need to see Corey's face again to know what was happening behind that door. Corey Reed had no idea that everything happening to him in that room had been arranged weeks in advance, quietly, methodically, the way Derek arranged everything in his life. And what was still coming for him, the collapse of his firm, the unraveling of his reputation across Chicago's business circles, was going to be so much bigger than one bad conversation in a conference room. By the time Derek reached the elevator bank, his phone had already buzzed twice. Ariana, confirming the investor withdrawal had gone through cleanly, and a second message from a number he didn't recognize, likely Corey scrambling to reach someone who might undo what had just been set in motion. Derek didn't answer either one right away. He rode down in silence, thinking not of Corey at all, but of the call he still needed to make to his mother, and of the quieter work still waiting once the noise settled. Stay close, because Anaya is about to come face to face with the man she gave up everything for. It took less than 6 weeks for Corey Reed's firm to collapse entirely. Word moved fast through Chicago's business circles once the recording found its way, through channels nobody could quite trace, into the hands of a few reporters who covered the city's investment scene. His remaining backers pulled out within days. The lawsuit from his former partner in Naperville resurfaced, no longer quiet. By the time the dust settled, Corey had closed his office, and the polished, arrogant man who once sat in that 15th floor conference room had all but disappeared from the circles he used to move through so easily. Anaya asked to see Derek one last time. She chose a small coffee shop on Adams Street, a few blocks from the building that used to define both their lives. And she arrived early, sitting near the window with her hands wrapped around a cup she never drank from. It was late November, and the wind off the lake had turned genuinely cold. Outside, commuters hurried past with their collars turned up, and a street musician down the block was packing up his saxophone case, done in by the weather. Anaya had chosen a table near the back, half in shadow, as if some part of her still didn't want to be seen. She looked different, thinner, the sharp tailoring she used to favor now hanging a little loose on her frame, dark circles beneath eyes that used to carry so much certainty. When Derek walked in, she stood so fast she nearly knocked over her chair. "Thank you for coming," she said. Derek sat across from her, calm as ever, and waited. "I know I don't deserve to ask you anything," Anaya said, her voice unsteady. "But I've had a lot of time to think, Derek, about what I threw away. About who you actually are, and who I chose instead, and what that says about me. I made a mistake, the worst mistake of my life. I want to come home." Derek studied her for a long moment before he answered, and there was no cruelty in his eyes, only a quiet, settled distance, the look of a man who had already closed the door and felt no wind trying to pull it back open. "There's something you should tell me first," he said. "Something true, not something you think I want to hear." Anaya's composure cracked. She looked down at her hands, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something raw and ashamed. "When I filed for divorce, before I knew anything about the building, I told my lawyer I wanted my fair share from the broke janitor. Because I figured if I couldn't have status, I could at least walk away with money."
I wasn't leaving out of love for Corey, Derek. Not really. I was leaving because I'd decided you weren't enough for the life I wanted, and I was prepared to take whatever I could on my way out the door. She pressed her palm flat against her mouth. "I've carried that for weeks. I needed you to know the ugliest part of it, not just the part where I got caught." Derek nodded slowly, absorbing it without flinching, the way he absorbed most things. It confirmed something he'd already suspected, quietly, for a long time. Not just betrayal, contempt dressed up as ambition. "I appreciate you telling me the truth," he said. "That took something." He thought, briefly, of all the small moments over the years he'd chosen not to examine too closely. The offhand comments about his job at dinner parties, the way she used to introduce him to her colleagues with a slight pause before the word maintenance, like it cost her something to say it. He let himself see them clearly now, without bitterness, simply as facts finally arranged in their correct order. "Does it change anything?" Anaya asked, hope flickering, small and desperate, across her face. "No," Derek said gently, "but it matters anyway." He reached into his coat and set a plain white envelope on the table between them. Anaya opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter on Coleman Family Trust letterhead, awarding her a scholarship toward a graduate certificate program at DePaul, fully funded, no strings attached. "I don't understand," she said. "It's a second chance," Derek said. "Not with me, with yourself. You're 39, Anaya. You've got time to become somebody you're actually proud of, if you want it badly enough. This isn't charity, and it isn't guilt. It's just something my family believes in." Anaya's eyes filled again, and this time she didn't bother wiping the tears away. "I don't deserve this." "Probably not," Derek said, without malice. "Take it anyway." He stood, and for just a moment let his hand rest lightly on her shoulder, the way he might have on any morning during the 11 years they'd shared a life. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, something quieter, an acknowledgement that she had once mattered to him and that some part of him still hoped she'd find her way to something better. "I hope you find a better version of yourself," he said. "I mean that." He turned and walked out into the cold, the wind coming hard off Michigan Avenue. He didn't look back through the coffee shop window. He didn't need to see her face to know she was still sitting there, holding an envelope that represented more grace than she'd offered him in the last several months of their marriage combined. Somewhere on that walk, he noticed he'd stopped calling her my wife, even in his own head. Not out of bitterness, but the way a person stops reaching for a coat they no longer own. It didn't hurt the way he'd expected. It just felt true. The story, as far as most people would assume, was finished. A cheating wife exposed, a fraudulent boyfriend ruined, a good man walking away with his dignity intact. But Derek Coleman wasn't finished. Not by a long way. Because at a groundbreaking ceremony on the South Side the very next morning, one Anaya knew nothing about yet, she was about to learn something that would change everything she thought she understood about her place in his story. And it was going to be the hardest thing she'd ever sit with. Stay tuned for the final part, because Anaya's biggest heartbreak is still waiting for her. 3 months later, Derek stood on a cleared lot in Inglewood, on Chicago's South Side, watching a small crowd gather for a groundbreaking ceremony. Behind him, a hand-painted sign read, "Coleman Commons, affordable housing for our neighbors." funded in part by the family trust his grandfather started with one quiet building purchase back in 1985. This wasn't revenge. Derek had made peace with that word months ago. This was something closer to a debt he felt toward the neighborhood that raised him, a way of turning a hard season into something that would outlast every headline about Corey's collapse or the whispers that followed Anaya out of Chicago's social circles. Bianca stood off to one side, wrapped in her good wool coat, watching her son shake hands with the alderman and the young woman from the housing nonprofit, wearing an expression Derek rarely saw on her, something close to unguarded pride. She'd told him once, on that same porch where the swing still creaked, that she never wanted a monument built for her family. She wanted a purpose. Watching him now, she figured he'd finally found the difference between the two. He was mid-conversation with the site foreman when he saw her. Anaya stood near the edge of the construction fencing, dressed plainly, a simple wool coat instead of her old tailored blazers, no jewelry catching the weak winter light. She looked smaller somehow, not diminished exactly, but quieter, like a woman who had finally stopped performing for a room. "I heard about the project," she said when Derek walked over. "I wanted to see it, and I wanted to see you. One more time, if that's all right." Derek nodded, and a couple of the workers nearby slowed their pace without quite meaning to, curious despite themselves. "There's something I think you should know," Derek said, his voice even, carrying just far enough for those closest to hear. "That scholarship I gave you, it didn't come from nowhere, Anaya. My father started a fund 15 years ago. He called it Second Chance. It's for women who made a serious mistake, who chose the wrong thing when it mattered most, but who still wanted to rebuild something honest afterward. You weren't the first person that fund has helped. You won't be the last. I've been part of this work for a long time, long before you and I ever sat down at that kitchen table." Something in Anaya's face changed, slowly, like a held breath finally releasing. It wasn't just shame anymore. It was the grief of realizing she hadn't been the center of anything, not even her own unraveling. She had imagined herself as the great betrayal of Derek Coleman's life, the singular wound he'd need years to recover from. Instead, she was simply one more name on a list of people he'd already made peace with helping. "I thought," she started and stopped, her voice catching. "I thought this was all because of me." "It never was," Derek said, not unkindly. "You just happened to be there when it mattered." Anaya's shoulders folded inward, and she didn't try to argue or plead this time. There was nothing left to say. She simply nodded once and turned to go, walking back across the lot alone, her steps small against the frozen ground, without a single person watching her leave the way an entire room used to watch her enter one. Derek didn't turn to follow her with his eyes. He looked back toward the foundation lines marked in the dirt, toward the future units that would house families who needed a fair shot at something stable. A pale winter sun broke briefly through the clouds, resting on his shoulders as the sound of hammers and the laughter of a few neighborhood kids drifted across the lot. Bianca walked over and stood beside him without a word, slipping her arm through his the way she had at his father's funeral, and the two of them stood together for a while, watching the foundation lines, saying nothing at all, because nothing needed saying. "People can leave you," he said quietly, mostly to himself, "thinking you're nothing but a janitor. And you can still build a whole neighborhood for people just like you. You can still find a way to heal the very folks who once hurt you the worst." That's the real upgrade. Not a title, not a building, just knowing exactly who you are and refusing to let anybody talk you out of it. This story reminds us that dignity was never about the title on a business card or the size of a settlement. It was always about the small, unglamorous choices nobody claps for. If you're recently widowed, try this. Some Sunday afternoon, take out his old toolbox from the garage and fix just one small thing around the house yourself, the way he would have. Then sit down with a cup of coffee and say out loud to the empty kitchen if you have to, one thing you're proud you finally did without him. If you're retired and the days have started feeling a little too quiet, call your grandson this week and ask him to walk you through something on your phone you've been too proud to ask about. Not because you need it, because it hands him the chance to feel useful to you, the way you spent decades being useful to him. And if you're still married after 30 or 40 years and you've caught yourself taking the quiet one for granted, the one who fixes the leaky faucet without being asked twice, sit across the kitchen table tonight and name one specific thing he did this week that you noticed. Not thank you for everything. One thing. Loyalty was never loud. It showed up on the ordinary Tuesdays nobody was watching. In a toolbox, in a phone call, in a single sentence you almost didn't bother saying out loud. That's the upgrade nobody can put a price tag on. And it's still sitting right there, waiting on you, starting tonight. Every line in these emotional stories comes from real human insight and lived experience. AI was used only to enhance clarity and pacing, allowing deep lessons about kindness, systemic bias, and personal strength to resonate with a global audience. Production team, story and screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.